Hey everybody, welcome as you're piling into Sales School Session 5. Today we're going to be talking about a number of topics. Before we jump in though, I want to share a sales story and walk through kind of a question that I encountered early on in my sales career that has carried me through it and helped me tremendously as well. So that question is in front of you right now. It's what is the driver? When I had just recently graduated from university and started my career at Procter and Gamble, this was a critical question that we were constantly asked by our managers and their managers. It's something that's demanded of us to know and understand. And it's one of the most critical questions you can ask yourself in sales, whether you are an individual contributor, whether you are a sales manager. This question will propel you to be a better salesperson, period. And the reason for this is in sales, we kind of have a tendency, which is ironic because oftentimes it's one of the fields and disciplines where you have a multitude of data points and aspects that you can look at. But it's one of the greatest faults of the salesperson themselves to get a little bit lazy and just fall back on one metric, and that is sales, period, dollars sold. And today, when we walk through this discussion, when we analyze and look at a lot of different points, what we're going to continually ask ourselves is this question: what is the driver? Because even though dollar sales matters, if you don't ask yourself, well, what is the driver? Why did sales go up this quarter? Why did they go down? Then what you're going to fail to do is understand what the critical force is behind the momentum or lack thereof in your sales cycle. And if you don't have an understanding of that, you can't influence it. And that's what's really important because we all want to make a difference here. And when you're looking to grow, what you really need to do is you want to make sure you're doubling down on the strategies that are working for you, while at the same time, what you're doing is cutting out the strategies and tactics that aren't. So let's take a look at today's agenda. We're going to talk about split testing. We're going to talk about the key metrics in lead generation, what they are, why they're used, how they're used, and also talk about some industry averages and benchmarks for reference. So if you are running some lead generation campaigns, you can get a good idea of what we're looking at here at Growth Genius and what our growth managers constantly obsess over in terms of how to make their campaigns work and function as effectively as possible. So without further ado, I think we went through a nice little sales story, walk through the agenda. We can start to dive right in here. And just a reminder as well, this is being recorded. It will be posted. And for those of you who might have missed the first couple of minutes, don't worry. The session will be live and you'll be, not live, it'll be recorded and you'll be able to check back on it after. So let's dive into split testing. So first of all, what is it? When do I use it? Basically, the whole idea behind split testing is you want to test a single variable across two components or two items, right? So the items are going to be exactly the same except for this single variable. The reason why this is important to outline and consider when you're split testing and starting a split test is because ultimately if you start to incorporate a change and variation in the variables that you're incorporating and testing, what'll end up happening is your results will be muddied, right? The use of split testing is and the core reason behind using it is really to make informed decisions, right? So if I'm using a certain hook at the start of my message and the start of my outreach, I want to understand if hook A is better than hook B. Or maybe my call to action. I want to take a look at call to action A versus B. So I want to understand what people are more receptive to and are replying to more often. So as we dive into split testing, I want you to keep this in mind. We're going to start with this very simple example here as well. And that's the wrong way to split test as we look at this. So you'll see on the left, we've got one email that is going to have a subject line, a breadth of body copy. And if you look in the middle section, it's highlighted on the right-hand side, but basically what this person is speaking about is compensation priorities at the company that they're prospecting into. And the message on the right is talking about recruitment practices. Now, when we go to the bottom and take a look at the call to action, we're noticing that one is asking for a meeting or a discussion. The other one is a more passive call to action. It's the interest close. So it's asking, what is your interest level in this? Because of this, this is a wrong way to split test because we're using two variables here, right? Let's give a more defined example of how this could impact the campaign. Using the interest close, you might generate a conversation. People might be more willing to respond to that because you're not asking for their time, a meeting. So reply number B here on the right-hand side may get more traction from a reply standpoint based on the close that you're using. Now, that being said, when you're taking a look at these as well, the problem is that maybe compensation priorities in the audience group you're prospecting into is a greater priority. So that may be a bigger draw. And so what you end up doing by creating a two variable split here and a two variable element in the body that's being tested is you're muddying the waters and muddying the data, and you're starting to actually lose control over your messaging and your understanding of what's going to work. So let's clean this up a bit. We've now taken a look at how this could work. And you're going to see now that we are just actually isolating the close. We're just isolating that component of the message, and we're going to see which close works better for us. This is definitely the right way to split test. This is a way that you're going to control your outreach and control your understanding of what's generating you conversations, what's bringing people's interest to what you have to offer. The other component is, you might notice I snuck something in here. The subject line is different between the two. So I know I just ranted a whole lot about how we're only going to test with one variable, but there is a reason I'm using a different subject line here. And that's because between split testing and using an app like Growth Genius, there may be a way where you can test a different subject line while also having a variation in the body copy. That's because there are two isolated measurements for each. So if you're testing a subject line, what you're really interested in is the open rate of the message. Because when a message lands in a user's inbox, that's what they see. They see the subject line. Sometimes they'll see a little bit of your hook as well, but primarily it's the subject line. So your open rate is always going to measure your subject line. Now, that being said, if you are using a variant on a subject line and also split testing your body copy, it's important that you look at your measurement accurately. So typically what you would do in a split test that uses the same subject line and then different body copy is you would look very quickly to the reply rates to see which body copy seems to be received better by the audience that you're prospecting into. Now, that being said, there's a disclaimer here. So when you're using a separate subject line, it's important to use what we call the body reply rate. So a typical reply rate will take the amount of replies you get divided by the messages that you've sent out. Fairly straightforward. The body reply rate is a little bit different. It's going to take a look at the amount of replies you have over the open rate of the messages that were sent out. So it's basically saying that instead of measuring a reply against all the amount of messages you've sent, we're just going to isolate the people that have opened it, because now that they got past the subject line, we're interested in, did our body copy drive that reply? And you'll see quickly how if you don't use this effectively, how quickly it can kind of create a perilous situation for you in understanding what's better or worse from a copy performance standpoint. We've got email 1A here and 1B. In email 1A, what we see is a very high open rate at 60.7%, right? Or 60.8% actually, if I'm rounding up. And on the other side, we've got subject line B, which has an open rate of 48%, right? Now, their reply rates are drastically different in this case. A 3.33% reply rate for B versus a 4.42% reply rate for A. Why do I say drastically different? Because when you consider it, subject line B is actually returning a 25% lower reply rate than subject line A, roughly. When we look, though, at the body reply rates, what we're actually going to see is that subject line B is generating a 6.9% reply rate versus subject line A at 7.3%. So the margin of difference between the two and the statistical significance has changed dramatically. Really, what we're finding here is that the subject line impacted these messages more than the body copy. So you could actually still use the body copy in subject line B. Now, I hope you're all still with me, and I hope that that was explained thoroughly. So that's the component about split testing that's really critical. Now, in summation of all we've talked about, make sure you're limiting your testing to a single variable in your split test. That's the most important thing. And separate major themes by campaign. Sorry, this is something that we touched on loosely, but I'll come back to it a little bit. When we were talking about the recruitment example, we used an example of recruitment versus compensation planning in this HR prospecting example. In that case, what you might want to do is have two different campaigns running and test which campaign is different and operating differently, especially because your audience for each might be a little different. The last component is if you're testing subject lines, make sure you're monitoring how you measure your reply rate if you're also testing different body copy as well. Even if you are testing the same body, this is probably a good rule of thumb to use. So with all of this in mind, that's what you always want to keep at the forefront of your mind when you're running split tests. Now let's talk a little bit about some key lead generation metrics, how key lead generation metrics work, and what to look for in your key lead generation metrics. So to start off, obviously, we're going to look at sales, right? Not necessarily. Let's pump the brakes on this one a little bit. We need to remember that sales are dependent on a series of processes that comprise the whole funnel. And lead gen is just a part of that funnel. It's kind of located in the top/mid section, if we want to look at it that way. So you won't realize a sale until everything is kind of filtered all the way through the bottom. There's a lot more to it than that. So when we think about the sales funnel, this is what you want to keep in mind. You want to keep in mind that when you're looking at your prospects and sourcing them, that's a component of lead generation. So how you source them, how you start your outreach, that's one component of your lead generation funnel here, as well as beginning the qualification, starting your follow-ups, judging reply sentiment. These are some things you look at as you pursue your leads. Now, when you get to developing qualified leads closer to the bottom of the funnel, you're going to look at what determines qualification and drives qualification, the quality of your presentation, the amount of meetings you've had. If you have to have 2 meetings versus 1 meeting to close, the frequency of either occurring, the negotiations, your pricing. There's a number of things that influence a sale. So when we look at lead gen, what we really want to do is we need to go back to the start of our session today and ask ourselves, what is the driver? That's what's going to be really key and critical to understanding how we should all be measuring lead generation as a whole and looking at this. So keep that in mind. Basically, what we want to remind ourselves of is what lead gen is and what it does. So at the start, the whole idea is we're going to find those prospects, source those prospects. So that's one component that we're going to want to understand and measure is our prospects, how we're sourcing them, where we're sourcing them, how many we're sourcing per month. These are things to keep in mind. The next thing is, as we begin to build a relationship with those prospects, what are the steps involved? How many steps do we use? These are things to also consider, and qualifying which prospects are most likely to buy our product or service. So what are the qualified messages that are coming in? I'm saying qualified messages, not yet a fully qualified lead. There's a little bit of a difference here, but also understanding what the negative responses are, what the frequency is. These are all components of lead generation that we want to measure, assess, and understand. Because if we do this, we'll be able to better understand how these numbers impact our greater sales number. So if you're with me still, let's take a look at how to measure lead gen. So I've broken this out into separate categories in terms of where we're at in the stage, whether we're sourcing leads, whether we're looking at the conversation itself, and whether we're in the qualification process. So when we talk about what we want to do to measure sales and lead generation specifically, I'm going to focus on the core metrics here. I'll leave the secondary metrics for you to review and take a look at later. Basically, contacts per month. How many fresh new prospects are we adding to our pool on a monthly basis? That's going to be a critical metric, because if it goes up 1 month and you're adding more prospects and everything else stays the same, theoretically, your sales are going to go up. So it's good to understand between month 1 and month 2 what that driver was. Oh, we increased how many people we spoke to. That increased our sales proportionately. Okay, well, there's your driver. Reply percentage as well. How many people are actually, when you're in the conversation stage, replying to your emails? Now, that being said, keep in mind you've got those secondary metrics there as well. And one component of those, as we get down to qualification as being a core metric, is the qualified conversation percentage. So this is going to strip out the negative replies, people who are messaging you saying, not interested, don't want to hear this, unsubscribe, all that stuff. So if you're getting those messages in reply, we want to strip those out, take a look at the positive messages. And also and not just positive, positive and neutral replies that constitute qualified conversations. So we'll talk a bit more about what a qualified conversation is shortly, but in essence, what we want to understand is where we have the greatest chance of success with our potential customers and where we can tap into them, how we can tap into them. And that's what this is going to give us some guidance and perspective on. So as 3 core metrics, those are what you want to look into when measuring lead generation, because ultimately, these are going to be your drivers at how effective your lead gen is. So in summary, right here, what we want to consider is where lead gen exists in the sales funnel. Let's focus on the number of new contacts per month, reply percentages to your messages, and qualified conversations. Also, understanding where your audience likely sits in the world of prospecting. This is going to be something that we're going to build on. So we're going to touch on this a little bit more in a second, but these are what's really critical. And I can't emphasize enough the qualified conversations element. One thing that we found at Growth Genius, just to give you some background here, is that about 10% of conversations close. That's positive, negative, and neutral. So if you just focus on your positive conversations, you are going to leave some money on the table because you're going to miss out on nurturing a neutral lead or even a negative lead who may not be prepared to buy that moment but may convert and may buy down the line. I'm not saying you should invest the same amount of time in each. That's a different conversation left for a different time in terms of allocating priorities. But what you want to keep yourself aware of is that with a bit of nurturing and with a little bit of extra time investment on your part, those neutral leads, those negative leads may ultimately convert. Let's take a specific example in this case, just because this is so critical to talk about. And that is, let's say you're in an industry that has, long protracted deals. We're talking deals that you might sign and your competition might sign with clients that will last up to, say, 2 years, 3 years plus. Well, what's going to happen in your sales cycle is you are going to encounter a vast number of prospects who are already locked into an agreement with one of your competitors. It's going to happen. So do you leave those deals and just, let them fall by the wayside? No. You're going to want to set a reminder in your calendar. You're going to want to set a reminder in your CRM to touch base with them in a year, or maybe even just every couple of months. Ask them, how are you finding the solution? What are your pain points here? By appropriately nurturing that lead, you are going to build a relationship with that customer. And that is going to be what triggers their interest in you down the line. You've invested your time, your energy into helping them, into being curious about them, their process. And that's how you're going to edge out your competition. So going all the way back to Sales School Lesson 1, never forget that your customer is your ultimate focus when you're working on lead gen and prospecting. So I'm really excited to share this next part of our presentation with you. I've worked with our team of experts here at Growth Genius to understand and build a good analysis of what some industry averages and benchmarks are across lead generation. So if you are going to Growth Genius after this, signing up for our app, using some lead generation on your own, you can use this information to help understand and analyze how your campaign is going to be performing against what the averages are. And what I'm also going to aim to help you do is understand what may be influencing the metrics if your campaign is performing better than or worse than these benchmarks. Because it is critical to understand that while these are benchmarks, there are lots of factors that make each element here up. So keep that in mind. We are going to take this with a bit of a grain of salt, but I am excited to share this info with you. So before we get to these benchmarks, we're going to review a few elements that you'll want to kind of keep in mind and note of how we prospect here at Growth Genius. So we tend to add between 600 to 800 new prospects to a campaign per month per person that we're working on behalf of. So if it's one person that we're working on behalf of and sending on behalf of, it's 600 to 800 new prospects being added to a campaign every month. If it's two, it's between 1,200 to 1,600 new prospects being added per month. You'll also want to make sure that per sending account, so per email address, you're not exceeding about 100 emails. That's what we would consider your hard ceiling to be. Soft ceiling, I would say, is about 75. If you're sending about 75 emails per day max, you're going to be playing it pretty safe in terms of your deliverability. Deliverability is another very important element to consider when you're performing lead generation and prospecting. It's not something that we really have time to delve into today in detail, but it's something we will be talking about, possibly even at next session. So keep that in mind, mark it in your calendar, and we will be tackling that issue in more detail. On LinkedIn, You want to send about 70 connection requests per day as well to play it safe there. LinkedIn will, send you an alert if you are over prospecting on their platform. They may temporarily ban or suspend your account. So keep these numbers in mind as you're prospecting. Now, here's what the key benchmarks look like. This is an analysis that was performed off of a number of campaigns through a whole wide set of industries and a whole bunch of different types of organizations that we've worked with. Obviously, as you can see here, it's separated by email campaigns and LinkedIn campaigns. We have is the various open, connection, reply, qualified conversation, so positive and neutral type replies versus negative conversations. So much more negative type replies, people saying like, no, I'm not interested, unsubscribing, etc. So at the bottom there, keep in mind that that tip covers what we have already spoken about. The qualified conversations are meaningful conversations that you create. They are both positive and neutral. You have to nurture those neutral campaigns. Responses. I can't tell you how many times we've seen folks come to us and wonder how they could get their sales to improve. And when we take a look at what they're doing and not doing, a key element to them not realizing even more success is just simply not nurturing some audiences that they already have established a baseline relationship with. So keep this in mind when you're prospecting. Now, in terms of these rates, I did mention before that we are going to take them with a bit of a grain of salt. And so I want to dig into a bit more about the why. What are the drivers here? Because if we are going to use these rates to benchmark our campaigns to understand, oh, am I performing well or not well? It's key to understand what is making these up, what's influencing them, what might drive my open rate to be significantly higher or my reply rate to be significantly higher versus, another campaign. So you want to take a look at external drivers and internal drivers that may influence this. And this is our disclaimer on these benchmarks and reply rates. So there are a lot of components that make these rates up. So here are a few that we are going to reflect on and talk about. I'm going to have a focused discussion after this slide on the audience and size of the company. We're going to review these in much deeper detail. But let's talk about your internal drivers first, right? Let's talk about your strength of offer. If you're offering a product or service to somebody, if you're just trying to get it in front of them, make them aware of it, you're just informing them about its existence. So that's going to influence their reply rate, because what they're solely going to be focused on in the body of your message is the benefits that your product or service will bring to them. Now, let's change this just a little bit. Let's say you're offering an exclusive 20% off your service if they're signing up this month. You're driving a bit of urgency. You're giving them value. They're saving some money. And hopefully, if you're prospecting right and reaching the key audience, you're tackling some of their pain points and adding a benefit to what they do. So your strength of offer can vastly increase and enhance your reply rate if you're tapping into that appropriately. The next is your sales cycle. Keep this in mind, right? If you're dealing with inbound clients, referrals, and they're taking you a month to close, 2 months to close, your outbound sales cycle may be even more extended and take more time to drive closure. So keep this in mind. Understand that this is going to impact a lot of what's going on. An element that may drive this is how dense your marketplace is with competitors. If you're operating in a space that has a lot of competition, there's a lot of options out there for a product or service, that may create a more protracted buying cycle because there's a lot more research somebody can and might do before they choose to buy. So keeping an understanding and an open mind about how your sales cycle actually will impact your results is something to be honest with yourself about on a regular basis. Next, your product and service. This is fairly straightforward, I would say, but your core offering itself is something that you have to be prepared to be critical of and understand. Not saying your products and services aren't great out there, but I'm saying what you have to understand is just how much value that product or service is adding to your customers and clients. Are you delivering them life-changing value? If so, you will eventually see that materialize in how your lead gen efforts operate, how your inbound marketing operates, and everything along the whole value chain. However, if what you're offering only gives me a minor incremental increase in benefit to what I'm doing, I may be less likely to reply because there's less urgency. If you're not changing the game in a dramatic way, that's certainly going to impact how people reply and receive your information. The next thing that you want to consider is the rate of reply. What do I mean here? You're seeing it under internal drivers. This isn't talking about how quickly somebody that you're prospecting into is replying. It's talking about, oh, sorry about that. It's rather talking about what the rate of reply is on that you are sending out versus that you are receiving. So are you getting back to a prospect within 24 hours? Are you getting back to them within 12 hours? These rates of reply, your urgency to them, your desire to help them is how they might perceive it, is going to impact how successful your campaign is. So make sure that you keep that in mind as you're kind of working through these metrics. Okay. Now I promised you we dig into those first components in even more detail as well, those external factors. So let's do that as we hop ahead. So what we're going to look at here is how your prospects themselves will affect your reply rate. So for simplicity's sake, what I've done here is I created 3 tiers. You've got your tier 1 clients, you've got your tier 2s, and your tier 3s. These clients, these prospects, are going to be comprised of different components themselves. So if we look at tier 1, that's a lead decision maker at a large organization in a popular industry. So what we're looking at here is like, are you trying to prospect into Jeff Bezos himself at Amazon? Yes, getting a deal with him might land you the contract of a lifetime, but how likely are guys on his level to be to respond to you? How likely are they to have the time to read your email? Plus consider, if you're prospecting into somebody at that size of an organization, your email might have to make it past a series of gatekeepers. His assistant is reading his emails before anybody else. So keep in mind, that's what a tier 1 audience looks like. The demand for somebody like that to sign off on a decision is going to be super high, but keep in mind that that rate of them actually responding is going to be super low. So that's how you're seeing those attention, demand, and reply rate arrows work. Basically, the reply rate is going to increase as we go down the scale here, while attention demand is going to increase. So that's kind of that tier 1 category. So the way you want to think about that in summation is these are going to be the tier 1 decision makers. They're going to be the key gatekeepers at major organizations. They're going to control large spending decisions. They are going to be in organizations that are vast in size. So those are kind of 3 qualities that may land them in that bucket. So tier 2, this is a good space to prospect into. In this space, you're going to get a good reply rate. Maybe sometimes on the lower end, depending on who you're prospecting into or the size of the org. But for the most part, you're going to be kind of sitting at that medium to good level of reply rate. So what are the key characteristics here? These are often secondary decision makers at large organizations. They may also be a lead decision maker at a small or medium business. Their time isn't demanded as frequently. And in terms of the budgets they command and decision-making power they have isn't quite as vast, but it may be what you're after. And this is why it's so important to understand your audience, because you really have to understand where they fit within this hierarchy, and therefore how that will likely affect all your rates when you're prospecting and performing lead gen. Now, when we take a look at the tier 3 grouping here, these are going to be tertiary decision makers at organizations. They may also be influencers, and we're going to talk about the difference between those two in just a second. But basically, in an organization here, they could be an organization of all sizes. Like if you're dealing with an influencer or a tertiary decision maker, they may still be at a Fortune 500 company. They just may not be commanding as large of a budget or making as many decisions on a as high frequency basis, but they may still be a viable prospect for you. And the second component here is they may be working in a multitude of industries. So keep in mind, point one, we're looking at popular industries. So in that case, like tech might be one, SaaS solutions. Sometimes you've also got retail being a very popular industry as retail continues to evolve, especially because of the emergence of e-commerce. Those may all be affected and fall into your tier 1 bucket. Your tier 3 bucket, though, this may be something like manufacturing, sometimes transportation and logistics. Like there may be a lot more niche industries that you're pulling into and seeing factor into a tier 3 kind of audience. So keep that in mind. Now, I promised I'd talk a little bit about what an influencer is versus a tertiary decision maker. So when we're taking a look at an influencer here versus a tertiary decision maker, an influencer is not going to really have that decision making power, but they may have influence and insight, and they may actually be able to push your decision forward while not actually impacting the final sale. They may not have the final word on this. A great example of this is if you're working in an emerging industry, something that's kind of happening on a widespread scale, or something that's very new, very up and coming, you may find that you'll get traction a lot more frequently with a younger audience of an organization who tend not to have as much decision-making power, but who might get more excited about your product or service. So what's critical to keep in mind here is they may still be able to help push your sale along, even though they're not making the final decision. They have influence over their managers and over their management. So just keep that in mind, bear in mind when you are looking at these rates and looking at these benchmarks. There are a lot of factors that impact them. And if we go back to the start of our session today, it's important to always ask yourself, what is the driver? If you are asking that question, if you are constantly curious about what is making things perform one way versus another, you are going to be a more effective salesperson overnight. I guarantee it. So in summary, when you're measuring and looking at these benchmarks, you want to look for qualified versus negative conversations of a slash line of 2.8 to 3.6. So 2.8 being your qualified conversations, 3.6 being your negative, and that's the ratio that you're after on email. Similarly, that slash line looks like 3.5 to 1.9 on LinkedIn. And lastly, ensure you nurture. Make sure you are taking those qualified conversations especially those neutral conversations, the ones that might not get you super excited right away. Make sure you are nurturing those conversations because they will result in sales. At least some of them will eventually. Now, one last thing that I do want to call out here quickly is when you're looking at the LinkedIn and email comparison here, one thing that you may want to keep in mind is that while the LinkedIn reply rates look better on a ratio perspective, keep in mind that especially the way Growth Genius operates and the way we recommend folks do their prospecting on LinkedIn is you want to connect first before you actually end up kind of in that sales conversation. You want to build that connection with the person that you're looking to prospect into. So because of that, you do kind of have a higher bar to jump over in order to prospect on LinkedIn effectively. While in email, when you have somebody's email and you know it's their email, you have access to their inbox. So just keep that in mind with how that impacts the reply rates and responses in those two cases. Again, let's ask ourselves, what is the driver? So I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank you all, especially the new guests, the returning guests, for making this an awesome journey as we kind of go through this. Our next session is going to be February 18th at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific, where we will continue to dive into kind of these theories and discussions around sales and prospecting and how this all works. Now, with respect to Growth Genius itself, feel free to check out our website, sign up for our app today at that hyperlink there, app.growthgenius.com/sign_up. And next session, as promised, I will look to make deliverability a key component there. If your messages today are ending up in your client's spam folders or somewhere other than the inbox, how do you change that? How do you influence that? How do you make sure your prospecting emails are more likely to land in somebody's inbox? It's a critical element to prospecting, so definitely don't miss out. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.